In this video, I'm going to explain why most concept artists or aspiring students have a really hard time getting creative, thinking outside the box, making unique designs. Also, I am going to share one incredibly simple trick that's going to make you wonder why they're not teaching this at every art school, specifically for design. Now, to give you a frame of reference, my name is Antonio. If you're new here, welcome. I've been a professional concept artist in the game and film industry for the last 8 years. And I've also created my own design studio, helping bigger projects with their creative thinking. And yes, it's a real studio. We even have coffee mugs. All right, just a sec. So yeah, thinking outside of the box has been a large part of my professional career. And for that reason, I wanted to make this video to help you understand there's actually one simple thing you can really do to make that a lot easier. Now, before we start with that, we're going to start with the problem. So what's the problem? Well, the problem is that if we look at a lot of concept art online, I just screen grabbed these from Google, okay? The thing you can immediately see when it comes to the design itself is that it doesn't really feel interesting or unique. You feel like you've seen this before. Even when I put, a lot of these together, like we've seen this type of sorcerer before. We've seen this type of whatever warrior, or I don't even know what this is. We've seen this type of knight before, right? It's not creative. Now, in a world with an abundance of content being created, characters being made, creatures being made, concept art being produced, especially now with AI just being pumped out, you can still stand out creatively. But the thing I see with these designs is that usually what ends up happening is that the artist is focused on getting a character pose out. And by the way, I don't want to call out anyone. I'm keeping this in here just for credit's sake. I'm just screen grabbing these. I'm not bashing on anyone's art. I'm just saying, like, I want to provide you guys with a solution to become more creative. Now, the thing what I see a lot is when people create these designs that are costume designs, not characters, by the way, is that it usually comes from a wide variety of references. And that is actually the problem. It's the wide variety of references that are the problem. So people look up, or they start a character, they start with a pose, something neutral like this. Nothing wrong with that, specifically if you want to do concept art design. Although I would always advocate to also add personality in your poses, hence watch my other videos. But when it comes to drawing your characters and then designing the costume, you start with a basic pose and then you start iterating on those costumes, right? That's a lot of the times what you do. Well, the thing is, what you then start doing is you start creating a reference board, a mood board, right? You've seen this in many tutorials. They advocate for creating a mood board, creating a reference board. And this is usually where it starts going wrong, because that mood board that you're creating, that you've piled together, is an amalgamation of so many different sources of inspiration that ironically, you end up with something very generic. I'm going to sip for my coffee and I'm going to repeat that. The reason a lot of designs look generic is because they're based or pulled from too many different interesting references. And so you start compiling all of the things you see online and you're creating a character almost like you're photo bashing or collaging things you see from reference into your character. Now this, and AI is guilty of this, by the way, this doesn't create interesting design. What it creates is a lot of noise, right? It creates a lot of noisy design, costume design, character design. It doesn't really create anything coherent. And when people want to create something coherent, they often have the misconception that it's all about shape language. Another thing I don't really like that people focus on too early. Shape language is important to know, but it's not the end-all be-all solution, or it's not the thing that's going to suddenly make all your art look fantastic if you're still pulling from too many different references at the same time. The big problem, I'm going to end it on that. The big problem is you're pulling from too many references. So let's go to some interesting designs. Let's go and look at least what I categorize as more interesting designs. Now, some of these are mine, these three, and others are from very famous IPs. Now, you might be thinking, wow, this guy really thinks highly of himself to only reference himself. Yes, I do. Anyway, going into the designs, what makes these designs more unique? For instance, I have never, this comes from our mermaid challenge that we did with Artwod. I have never seen a mermaid / like killer whale design like this ever. And I think I created this 3 years ago. So there might be some floating around now, but I've never seen anything like this. And this is your job as a designer, to create unique things, to create things within a framework that already exists, but make them interesting. I recall having worked on a game called Century Age of Ashes, where we had to design dragons. Now, try to design interesting, uniquely looking dragons when there's already a million type of dragon designs. Okay, so that's when you will start to realize the importance of being a designer, and it will teach you how to be more creative in very specific ways. When we look at this design, there's nothing necessarily special about it, but it's unique. And the reason it's unique is the same reason that this is unique, this is unique-ish, this is unique and fantastic, and this is unique and fantastic. What they all share in common is that they all pull from almost one source of reference. And that is the solution. We have the problem on the left side, and the solution on this right side is that you need to exhaust one frame of reference. What do I mean by this? Well, if we go back to the whale design, the whale itself, that's just a bit of my experience with, I reference a killer whale, orca, and I transform it into a creature with hands. Nothing. I'm just anthropomorphizing this creature. There's nothing special about this. But I'm creating a unique sort of focal point by adding armor to it that you've not necessarily seen anywhere else before. Now, the biggest secret that I use to do that is called the association rule. And what the association rule does is that I basically associate my main subject with something that we usually associate it with. So in this case, killer whale, they hunt shark, or at least they're not afraid of shark. So my association was with sharks. So what do I do then? Sharks are my only reference point for this armor. Only reference point. And from there, I start trying to be as creative as possible in using whatever I can from sharks, from the shark skeleton to shark features, and introduce that as some type of armor on top of this killer whale. And that's all I do. And here's the thing, guys. Limitation creates creativity. That's where creativity comes from. If you're creative, if you're handling something creatively, it means that you're handling it within a boundary of limitation. MacGyver, a lot of you might be too young to know who MacGyver is, but he was this TV hero kind of, and he could always escape out of situations with the bare minimum that you wouldn't expect him to come out of. And that is why he was associated as being a genius, so to speak, is because he was creative within limitation. He could make a rocket launcher out of toilet paper and a pair of dental floss, so to speak, right? So he was limited in his options, and he was creative with those options. And this is where you start to become creative. Same thing for the other design. So in this case, this is also from the Mermaid Challenge. This is another creature design, and I just wanted to create specifically a creature, no armor, but I was like, okay, I want to create some type of fish creature, but I don't know what. So I associate just the sea with, in this case, a blowfish, and I just exhausted the hell out of it. I used all of those sort of blowfish kind of features that I can to create this creature. But also, when I wanted to use color, I just literally bashed a photo of a blowfish in here and then just used adjustment layers to create my first layer of color and then start painting with that. So again, I'm exhausting all of my options within one option. Same thing here for the swan captain. So I wanted to create a swan captain. So just that was it. This is more shape language related, but still it's very closely related to what I'm trying to say. So I'm trying to create a pirate's costume, a captain pirate or a pirate captain from the 18th century. I knew the kind of attire that they wore, but I didn't really need an association because we associate pirates with sea or plundering or just that century. In this case, I didn't want to do that. I wanted to create a more elegant pirate. And then my sort of practice of association kicked in again. The association with elegance for me was a swan. So I used a swan and I exhausted my options for a swan. So the captain's hat is based on a swan, very obviously. The hilt of the sword are swans grouped together. The clothing here are just literally swan feathers. And the hip guards here, as well as this satchel, is literally based on a swan's foot. So that's what I'm using. I'm exhausting my options with one reference. And by doing that, I become more creative or I make more creative designs. And if we look at famous IPs, one of my favorite characters is Reaper from Overwatch. It's the exact same thing. So Reaper from Overwatch is fantastic character design. A lot of the original character designs from Overwatch are fantastic, by the way. And a lot of them follow this rule of association and exhausting one option. Reaper, all of its shape language is based on the symbolic representation of death. In this case, a skull, right? So the skull is the representation of death, and the designs itself, everywhere you see here, they're using that shape of the skull in as many forms as they creatively can. And because of that, it creates a very coherent design. So they're limiting or they're exhausting their options. And within that framework, they become very creative with what they create. And then lastly, one of my favorite ones when it comes to armor design is the armor designs from Monster Hunter. And it's the exact same. So they have, and this is a cool thing, actually, this is sort of next level. They have a lot of different types of monsters that they created in Monster Hunter. And so based on those monsters, they create armor. And so what they do is they take one particular monster and then they start creating armor on top of that, or they start creating armor associated with that monster. And so they become very creative on how to actually create all of these different functional armor pieces, from the pauldrons to the elbow guards to the hip guards to whatever. They become very creative with that limitation, with the limitation of having just that one monster and then creating as many variations of that possible sort of reference as the armor. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is for me one of the best ways, if you struggle with being creative, to getting more creative designs. So to recap the problem, stop or avoid having too many different pieces of references in your mood boards, and instead associate what you want to create with something, right? A focus, in this case, it can be a direct association like I did with killer whales and sharks, or it can be a more implied association like what I did with the captain and elegance, or it can be more of a symbolic association like we have from Reaper with death. But when you make that association and when you have your reference, exhaust it to the best of your abilities, because then you are forced to be creative within that limitation. And when you do that, you will just quickly notice how much more creative you can be instead of literally copying from all of your references onto the paper directly. Because what you're just doing then is you're collaging something that already exists in a different order. That's not being creative. Being creative is creating something new and unique within limitation. All right? So I'm actually pretty positive that this will help you and has helped you by just watching this video, because I've seen it help a lot of people and a lot of people respond really well to having this information. So with that said, go out, practice it. When you do your next character or creature design, limit yourself to just one piece of reference and exhaust it to the best of your abilities. All right, happy creating. See you in the next one.